Hello everybody, 16.4 is the last part of chapter 16. We're looking at where meiosis and mitosis happen in life cycles of different organisms. To start off with, we look at the human life cycle and see that when we have a haploid sperm and a haploid egg, they will fertilize and join to make a diploid zygote. Those sperm and egg are 23 chromosomes, as you recall. So your zygote will be 46 chromosomes. And what happens is that the zygote will reproduce by mitosis and make its 100, trillion cells and grow into the adult. When the adults are forming sperm and egg cells, that is when meiosis happens. When an individual is growing, that's when mitosis happens. In this picture is showing you the same thing, that meiosis is the process in which gametes are formed. Once there's fertilization, that zygote will carry out mitosis to just grow into the adult. So this is kind of an obvious life cycle because it's familiar. You can see where cells are haploid, that is sperm and egg. You can see when cells are diploid, that is the fertilized egg, as well as the individual that's growing or the adult. We know those are all diploid. So as we go through other organisms, you will be asked about those exact events. When is there meiosis happening to form gametes? When is there mitosis happening? And that's when the growth of the individual is occurring. Now we're going to go through a few different organisms. The first one is prokaryotes, or one-celled organisms that don't even have a nucleus, and so that's like bacteria, blue-green algae. And when they reproduce, they basically will just multiply their DNA or double their DNA and then split in half. So this is very much like our regular mitosis of our cells, where we have one cell, we end up with two cells, and they will be regular diploid cells. And so this is very simple method, and the issue is that there's not a lot of genetic diversity there. And so we bring up the fact that someone has discovered that there's conjugation or transfer of some genetic components, some genes, from one bacteria to another. And they've got this in this photograph saying, just like in humans, when there's chunks that are exchanged and crossing over, this is a similar sort of thing where some of the chromosomes can switch places and we can get a mix of genes in these bacteria, which we know that helps the strength of that species when there is a mixing or diversity in their genetic combinations. Another way that reproduction happens is through this budding process, where a sponge, for example, which is an animal by the way, grows a little bud off the side, and sponge have areas where they make sperm and areas where they make eggs, and they will swap those sperm and eggs with a sponge that's nearby. So they do have a sexual method of reproduction, but they also, if for example they can't find another sponge to reproduce with, they also have this other method of making more sponges, which is growing these buds. And this is something similar that yeast does, that grows by budding. A hydra, same thing, grows by budding. And so it's just growing a little mini version of themselves, and that breaks off and can root itself in the bottom nearby, and That's a method of reproduction. Vegetative reproduction is when a part of the original plant starts spreading like strawberries, and these little extra roots will die, and that strawberry has sent out a little runner of itself and created more plants. So strawberries do that. Spider plants also have runners, and if they're near the earth, those runners can root themselves and plant in as well. Those will be genetically identical to the original. Fragmentation is when a piece like a cutting of a plant can be taken and rooted and start growing, and that would also be genetically identical to the original. Parthenogenesis is an interesting phenomenon that you can check out in these cool videos, where unfertilized eggs start growing basically by mitosis, and they grow into an adult, like in zebra sharks and lizards and bees. So they find that some of them are sterile and their cells are only haploid, and they've grown into an adult. Even though that egg cell was never fertilized, it still grew into an adult. So that's kind of an interesting phenomenon, parthenogenesis. Spores, this is sometimes they're haploid, sometimes they're diploid, but spores are a cool thing that stays dormant until the conditions are right. So for example, mushrooms, this came from a mushroom that lost its spores where the gills of the mushroom were. You lay it on paper, when it dries and the spores fall, they make this pattern. But those spores will be in the earth, and generally mushrooms, for example, grow in the spring when it's warm enough and moist enough, conditions are right, the spores will grow. So this brings us to the concept of alteration of generations. When we look at plants, there are parts of its life cycle where there's a sporophyte, or a part that makes spores and makes basically spores that are haploid by meiosis happening. And there's a generation that's a gametophyte generation, where it's going to produce gametes that are able to be fertilized. So in plants, there seems to be one of these generations that's more dominant, and that is very visually dominant. You can see that that's the generation that's normally associated with that plant. And one that's generally not dominant, but it's not the same for all plants. So in a fern, the sporophyte stage is dominant, and in, for example, moss, the gametophyte stage, the gamete producing stage, is dominant. And so what you see in a moss plant is actually the little mosses that form sperm and form eggs. Whereas in a fern, the dominant part is like a fern leaf that formed little spore cases. So the sporophyte stage is the more dominant. In the life cycle of a fern, it's kind of a cool cycle to see, and especially if you've ever seen a fern, or have it in your yard, or have seen it in the forest. The fronds here have little spore cases. They have these little fiddleheads that uncurl and form a frond or a leaf of a fern. And at the underside of that leaf, you will notice these little spore cases, which you'd have to look pretty close here to see them. I don't see them in this picture. They must be pointing the other way. But basically, there's these little spore cases underneath the underside of a fern leaf. And those spore cases are forming spores that are haploid because they're formed by meiosis. And so the spores are actually haploid. And when they fall and start growing, those haploid spores actually form this heart-shaped, what we call a gametophyte, that forms eggs in one area and sperm in another area. And so from this little heart-shaped gametophyte, which it looks like this in real life, little eggs are formed in one area, sperm in another area, and if there's enough moisture there, the sperm from one of these heart-shaped areas, heart-shaped structures, will mix with sperm and egg to another one, and they'll start growing the leaves right out of them. And so it's kind of a neat thing because these spores are growing this structure. The gametes come out of these structures still haploid, and when they join, they're going to form a diploid, a zygote that starts forming this diploid plant. So yes, this plant is all diploid, but as you can see, the dominant generation is this sporophyte or spore case forming structure, and you can see how there is a haploid and diploid stage, how there's a stage that has mitosis and a stage that has meiosis happening. Next thing we're looking at is moss, and there was an error in the textbook picture, so make sure that you do have diploid written in this section. And so you notice that what's dominant here, what you guys know as moss, that looks like this fluffy green stuff here, that moss is actually a haploid stage. And so when you step on moss, you may not realize that some are little girls and some are little boy mosses. And the girl ones are making eggs at the very top, and the boy ones are making sperm at the very top. And if there's enough moisture at what stage of the year, when there's enough moisture, usually moss grows in moist areas. You know how they say it grows on the north side of a tree where there is less sun. That's because it needs moisture for the little sperm to get to the eggs. So the little sperm and egg formed at the top of our little mosses are going to join together, and what happens when the zygote forms is it actually grows out the top of the girl one, this would be the female moss, and this part that grows out, this little spore case, is the only diploid thing about the whole moss, is this little spore case. And the spore case would look something like this. And so that's kind of interesting because this whole moss is haploid, but the little spore cases are diploid. And so what happens when that little spore case forms is that it is releasing, meiosis is happening inside of there, and it releases these little haploid spores. And some will fall and make girl mosses, and some will fall and make boy mosses. And we start all over forming eggs and sperm that can get fertilized. So it's a kind of a neat, this part that forms gametes is called the gametophyte generation, and this part that forms the spore case is the sporophyte generation. And so you can see here the gametophyte in this case is the dominant one that you would see, and it was the sporophyte generation, the spore forming structure, that was dominant in the case of ferns. Moving on to conifers or cone-bearing plants. I think these are very, very cool. Again, there was an error in your book. Make sure it says sporophyte is the diploid side. Basically, when you see these life cycles on quiz questions, they may be life cycles of organisms that you haven't seen in these examples, but because you've studied that there is a place where there is gametes, and those gametes must have been formed by meiosis. When the gametes join and fertilize, they will grow into an individual by mitosis. As long as you can find those locations of a life cycle, you can answer any question. So here, looking at the life cycle of the cone-bearing plants, you can see that there are actual male cones and female cones, and some people don't realize that when they look at a cone-bearing plant that there are two kinds. I just wanted to show you the picture here that the cones, when you see them, the female ones, if they have not released their little seeds, would be closed looking, and basically pollen from a pollen cone, from a male cone, would land here, and those little enzymes, similar to what sperm have, little enzymes on the pollen would make their tunnel into where there's an egg cell, or basically what you'd call a egg inside of the cone, and fertilization will happen in there and form seeds. And when the time is right, the cone opens up, and the little seeds, usually they're like, have the shape of a wing, so they fly through the air and fly elsewhere besides right under where the mother tree is. But those little seeds will fly away and get planted somewhere. So these are pictures of female cones. This is a picture of male cones. So if you look at a cone bearing tree in your yard or in a park or something, look way up and you'll see some tiny cones. They're really small in a big cluster. Those are the male ones, and they're the ones that are going to form pollen, which is the male gametes. And these would be the female cones, and these are the ones that contain eggs inside. So going back to our life cycle, you can see that the little pollen is formed by the male cones, and there are eggs inside the female cones. And when the pollen lands on the female cone and bores its way in, these little seeds can be formed after fertilization. So these seeds kind of look like this, wingtip seeds, and they will fall and they will start growing, of course, by mitosis into this adult plant. And as we form these gametes, this is, of course, meiosis, because making gametes is always meiosis. And the growing of the tree will be mitosis. So this person cut apart a female cone that was fertilized. You could see the little fertilized eggs here that have formed seeds that are ready to be released when the time is right. Sometimes cones, especially lodgepole, don't get opened unless there's like a forest fire, and then they pop open, and basically that's why coniferous forests often repopulate themselves after a forest fire. It's because the heat will pop open the cones, and those little seeds will be released. And sometimes if you are at a campsite and find some closed cones that are on the ground, you can put them on a campsite, and they will pop open like this, and the little seeds will come out. So it does take some heat if they're lodgepole pine cones, and they'll start growing like this into a tree. Alrighty, so the last life cycle that we'll talk about is Cnidaria. This is jellyfish, and interesting thing about the jellyfish is that we generally think about a jellyfish like this, but that's actually a medusa stage of its life cycle, and it does make eggs and sperm. Generally, an eggs and sperm from two different ones would typically be the ones that fertilize each other, because the eggs and the sperm of one would be released at different times, so they're not really self-fertilizing. But the egg and sperm can be released from there and form a zygote. So we know that forming those will be a process of meiosis, forming gametes. But after it's a zygote and starts growing, it will be mitosis. And when it grows, it actually grows into this polyp that lands and grows off the bottom of the ocean. And the polyp will grow. It can bud little polyps. But what's interesting is those polyps can actually flake right off, turn over, and be the medusa stage. So there's just a really interesting sexual type stage and asexual type of reproductive stage for jellyfish. Kind of a really cool little thing. So jellyfish, you typically think of jellyfish looking like this medusa stage, but also there is the polyp stages, and that is still a jellyfish. There's some advantages to sexual reproduction, of course, the ability to have the genetic recombination. Asexually, you can have more offspring more quickly, less energy on the parent. And so there is some advantages to both kinds of things. So organisms that have an alteration of generation with a part that has sexual and asexual stages or abilities of reproduction basically maybe have the best of both worlds. And so things like the spider plant that can make little runners and little babies asexually, but also can have sexual reproduction and form seeds, flowers and seeds. They can do both, so they have best of both worlds. Okay, that's our talk on 16.4. Check out the review